The DSOs, we're not clinicians. Our doctor groups, they're the clinicians and they control the clinical values. The DSOs, all they want to know is that there's not a tremendous amount of liability out there. And if you don't have any clinical calibration across all of your practices, there's a huge liability there.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to the 88 Show. This is the internet's only dental show where we talk about what matters most in marketing. I am your host, Joshua Scott. This is episode 115. And man, I got my special guest. This is Josh Swearingen in the house. This kind of month, this topic, we're all into group practice marketing, which is why I had you come on, because that is your space. Give everybody, these guys, a little bit of background. How did you get into that space? I mean, how did you get into dentistry?
Sure. Well, I got into dentistry just basically as a sales rep. I worked for a couple of different distributors. First in the ortho space, and then the company I worked for was acquired by Henry Schein.
Yeah. And
then I worked at Henry Schein for several years. Towards the end of my tenure with Schein, I had the opportunity to run a small group practice. It was 9 locations, $20 million in collections. And the goal through that process was to clean things up and optimize systems, and then either go for private equity and go big, or the owner was a wonderful man, 62, 63 years old. And he was kind of trying to decide if he really wanted to stick around and put the work into going big. And ultimately he decided that once we got everything cleaned up, he wanted to sell out, and he sold to a national DSO, and that left me with looking for another opportunity in the group practice marketplace. And I'm currently working with American Dental Partners.
Okay.
It's a fantastic national DSO. I believe we're number 5 or number 6 as far as size goes. We have about 330 locations nationwide, and I am in there on their M&A team. So I go out and I help purchase practices.
Okay. What word do you use? DSO, group practice? Does it depend?
Any compilation under somewhat of a consistent ownership, it can be a group practice. Once you get into the DSO side of things, you've actually legally separated the dental service side of the organization. It's a huge challenge in the marketplace right now because you have a lot of these younger entrepreneurial doctors who they've been told over and over and over again that they need to get to 3 or 4 locations, 3 or 5 locations. But the problem you run into is that once you get to 5 or 6 locations, and we see this all the time, there's a really high burnout rate because the doctors they've done what they thought they were supposed to do. They went out and they bought a bunch of practices, but they haven't operationally scaled them properly, and they're not set up to succeed with any kind of a management structure or anything like that in place. So it causes a lot of problems, and really it causes a tremendous amount of burnout with group practice owners.
Yeah, and you probably saw this more with your time at Schein, and I'd love to know how you advise, because these dentists, because I feel like everybody I'm talking to on the phone is like, yeah, I'm going to do this one, it's going to succeed. And they're already in their head onto 3, 4, 5 locations.
Yeah.
What I see is a lot of doctors go in, they can build one successful practice. You can even duplicate yourself into a second, but at some point it's less about clinical skill and even owning a business, and it's more about leadership.
Sure.
And I think that's the disconnect, right? Is by the time you get to 3 practices, now it's a leadership skill set, and most don't develop that. Your time with Schein, how were you dealing with that more? How were you coaching that?
It's a big struggle. You have a lot of dentists that love being dentists. I mean, they spend their entire lives focusing on a little 4x4 area and being experts in that field. Right. The way I handled it, a lot of it was really just simple conversations at the front end of, what's your goal in this? What do you want to do? Because if you want to be a clinician and you love dentistry, then you just back it up a little bit and you say, you'll be a great clinical director, you'll be a great mentor, you can lead the other dentists in the group, you can teach them all of these skills, but you need to understand that there's going to come a point where you have to step aside and allow someone to come in and run the business side of things. Or vice versa. They may be fantastic business people and they need to bring in someone clinically that can mentor the younger doctors.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, because it doesn't mean it disqualifies them or they can't do it. I think there's a place for that. It's knowing, what you're getting into and your skill set. Do you think overall one of the benefits with this kind of DSO expansion and acquisition mode happening, do you think the business level of dentistry on the whole is getting higher?
Sure. A private equity cycle, they usually last between 5 and 7 years, and we're right around the 3rd cycle of that over the last 20 years in dentistry. Each successive cycle gets a little bit smarter and smarter and smarter. So acquisitions that were made 15 years ago may not get made today. The way DSOs run their business 15 years ago is not the way that they run them today. There's significantly more cognizance of public opinion. There's more cognizance of what the dentists are looking for, things like that.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, I think that's good you brought that up, because you and I both know people and have come across people that are literally trying to put 10 to 15 to 20 practices together as fast as they can to flip it and get, and basically cash out on it. Is there a downside to that? Like, what's your guys' kind of role? I mean, just in the current state of things.
You may have been able to originally get away with throwing together 10 or 15 practices and then just trying to sell them in a bundle. That doesn't work very well anymore. And I can list off probably a half a dozen mid-sized group practices that are in that 10 to 20 to 30 location range where they haven't properly built out a management team. The practices are all relatively different. They have different contracts with doctors. They have no consistency from location to location. You're going to eventually have an educated buyer come in and they're not going to want to pay what you want to receive out of it. So there's a huge downside. And I think that they talked about it at Dykema last week. They talk about one of their driving goals in an acquisition from a PE standpoint is ensuring that there's clinical calibration from practice to practice to practice, because the DSOs, we're not clinicians. Our doctor groups, they're the clinicians and they control the clinical values. The DSOs, all they want to know is that there's not a tremendous amount of liability out there. And if you don't have any clinical calibration across all of your practices, there's a huge liability there.
Yeah, I love that. At what point, because I think you've worked with these kind of groups of 2 or 3 and they're getting started. At what point do you need to start putting together management team, leadership team, whatever you call it?
Sure. I mean, there's no really set parameters for that. One of the numbers that gets tossed around a lot is it's a 7% rule. And a lot of the general practices indicate they take roughly 7% to cover a lot of the various management functions that a lot of those DSOs can provide. So if you're doing $10 million in collections, if you pull 7% out, that's $700,000. That's your management services budget. You can start pulling pieces and parts. I'm a firm believer in outsourcing to experts, and I'll give you just a couple of really minor examples. On the human resources side, I don't know that you need to have a human resources officer, but I do think you need to have a really good outsourcing partner and an intermediary at the practice that can handle human resources. Marketing. I think that you need to have someone on the team that can be kind of a marketing intermediary with your marketing group. But there's so many different areas of marketing, you can't possibly hire one person that can be an expert in all of them. So you need to outsource huge portions of that. So and so on and so on. So you can find these intermediary positions to support these really, really critical roles while you're building out other aspects of the business.
Okay. Exciting space for sure.
Awesome.
The next 5 to 10 years, what do you see? What's some of the things that are going to happen?
There are now between 4 and 6 times as many private equity groups in the space as there were 3 to 5 years ago. There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines waiting to come in. I think that you are going to start seeing fewer and fewer acquisitions of private practices, and you're going to start seeing some pretty large scale DSO movement. So a single location entity is not that much less complex than a 5 location entity or a 10 location entity if those entities are run properly. So from our perspective, it's a lot easier to look at a 20 or 30 location group and say, all right, this is going to take a lot of resources, but all of a sudden from a growth target perspective, I've made a huge jump. The energy to assimilate one is almost like just too much. Like, let's get a group of 20 because there's just things in place. As long as they're well run, which you're really starting to see a lot of these group practices that are growing right now. They're operationally, they're pretty solid.
Cool.
So,
dude, thanks so much for stopping by.
Man.
But it was good to hang out. I love what you're doing in the space.
Likewise.
It needs more of that. I mean, it needs like more of these educators to come in and help. And I know your willingness to just step out there and help anybody who's trying to navigate it, trying to figure it out. I know you're just always available and just your heart is to help and serve. So
it's a great industry. There are a lot of really, really good people. There's a lot of fun to be had, and I just enjoy it. I'm incredibly blessed to be in it.
Cool. Well, dude, thanks for being here. Guys, that wraps up episode 115. Josh and Josh signing off from the studio. Best place to find me is at Instagram, at Joshua Scott. Look it up, man. Leave me a comment, shout out. Would love to hear from you, seriously. We'll see you on the next episode.